The Deep South is a setting we rarely see in video games. Well, there's The Walking Dead set in Georgia and Resident Evil 7 set in Louisiana. But a game focused on the folklore culture of the Deep South is definitely an underutilized premise. That's what South of Midnight brings to the table. South of Midnight promises a fantastical Southern Gothic adventure full of action and mystery. And it would have been such a great game if it wasn't for a few faults. Where does South of Midnight fall short? Let's find out in the review. The game's story follows our protagonist Hazel as she prepares her belongings for evacuation because a big storm is ravaging her hometown of Prospero. She checks on how her neighbors are faring during this storm, but as she does, her house gets carried off by the rushing river with her mother still in it. She chases after her house as it is carried down the river, but as she does, she starts seeing and experiencing strange things along the way. The river carries Hazel's house away far too fast for her to catch up, and she decides to ask her grandmother for help instead. While she was in her grandma's house, she found these magical hooks that allowed her to interact with the strange strands she saw along the way, awakening her power as a weaver. A weaver is someone who can see the paranormal and the warps in the grand tapestry due to trauma known as stigma. A weaver has the ability to unravel these stigmas and learn the truth of the traumas that caused them. This then directly ties into one of the biggest themes of the story, which is hurt people hurt people. And considering the history of cotton plantations, slavery, and poverty in the Deep South, it definitely is a prime spot for a lot of hurt. They do a great job of exploring this cycle of hurt theme in different contexts: family, community, work, and sometimes how all these contexts contribute to each other. They also naturally blend the theme with the paranormal and folklore aspects of the setting. However, there are some places where the storytelling starts showing its faults. One is the pacing. It felt like the main story gets sidelined in some chapters, and after every chapter you go, "Oh, that was a nice story. Wait, what happened to our mom again?" You get caught in the story of one chapter, then you're kinda reminded that your mom is missing at the end of it. I get that there's some thematic connection, an underlying thread that ties it all together, but I feel like they could have fleshed that out a little more, made the relationships between these characters a little more apparent. They could have done a before the storm segment in which they established the characters and their relations and did some world building before getting into the story. It would have been easy to do since it's a small town too. This would have given us a chance to get invested in the characters before putting everything into motion. This world-building prologue would have especially benefited Laurent's story arc. I went into that chapter knowing nothing about him, and his story would have been more effective if his identity was hinted at in some way earlier on. Another thing is that the story arcs feel kinda episodic from the main "Where's My Mom" storyline. You finish the chapters and the people you helped back then don't really come back in a full circle kind of way later, leading you to think, okay, what was the point? Well, the point was to illustrate that hurt people, but I still wish that these separate, almost episodic chapters came together in a big payoff later on. We want to say that the gameplay makes up for the story's misses, but the gameplay has its own faults. Mainly that it's a little lackluster. The game is an action-adventure, and if I were to describe the gameplay in the best light I can, it felt pretty nostalgic. It felt like the good old simple action-adventures of the PS1, PS2 era, with its simple action and simple platforming. You have attacks, you have dodges, and you have skills. The attacks are pretty rudimentary. You mash the attack button and that's it. The dodges are a little more interesting because if you execute a perfect dodge, you let out a little blast that can damage your enemy. There are skills that can stop the enemy in its tracks, push them away, pull you towards them, and even one that can convert an enemy to your side for a set amount of time. It felt good at first, like I was playing a game from my childhood or something, but I also realized that the more you get into the gameplay, the more it kinda flatlines. They introduced different types of enemies to change things up, but I realized that you don't really need to change your fight style much, and that just plain beating them up will suffice most of the time. One thing that I will give the game is that getting surrounded and overwhelmed by enemies definitely made things more challenging. But outside of that, the game doesn't really challenge you to think differently about battle. Maybe my problem is that I stayed in the normal difficulty when I could apparently take much more of a beating than that. Platforming is, as I mentioned, also fairly rudimentary. It gives you a lot of mobility options like gliding, wall running, double jumping, and all that. But it never really felt like the platforming parts challenged me. It reflects the same points with the combat where it works, but it doesn't really do much more than that. Maybe more puzzles and more challenging platforming maps could have given the game a little bit more spice and flavor to its platforming. Where the game truly shines is in its presentation, the art direction, and soundtrack. The game looks gorgeous. The hand-painted looking style is very unique. The intro has this claymation sequence that looks like a labor of love that took a lot of work to accomplish. I don't know if limiting the cutscenes to 30 FPS was intentional or not, but it did give the cutscenes a claymation style of movement despite being 3D CG models. The environments also look stunning. The folklore creatures are designed beautifully and with a lot of consideration for the style and themes of the game. You can tell that they applied music to the game in a very deliberate and well thought out way. If you listen carefully, there are special sound effects for just about every skill Hazel dishes out. There are also themes made specifically for certain story arcs, which really help elevate the emotional impact of these story arcs.
He was my brother. Benji is name.
Sorry to be moving you around like this.
All things different. He was my shade.
The way it expertly weaves this distinct sound into its gameplay, story, and visuals is nothing short of impressive. Pair that with a mostly stellar voice cast, delivering masterful performances, and you've got a soundscape that stands toe-to-toe with the game's stunning visuals. South of Midnight is a game with a vision, with a message, but it fumbles in its execution. The game is an experience for both the eyes and the ears. However, while the game has an interesting premise and setting, the story needs a little more cohesiveness. The game plays just fine, but doesn't really go beyond just fine. Good thing is that the game has a fairly low barrier of entry at 40 USD, which is great for anyone who would want to experience the game for themselves. All that said, we still see some value in this game and we're giving the game a 74. That's all we gotta say about South of Midnight. Are you planning on getting the game? If you already did, how'd you find it? Do you know of any obscure indie games that are set in the Deep South? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe for more game reviews and other video game related content. This has been GameMate, and we'll see you next time.